Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of This Week in Hearing. I'm Brian Taylor, and I think most of us that are clinicians out there know that there's a lot of stress in the world today. We've been dealing with COVID for a long time, up and down. It seems like every few months. Inside the clinic, we have some stressors around over-the-counter hearing aids, uncertainty with that. We have uncertainty around legislation around with Medicare and how possibly down the road I may pay for hearing aids. There's really no shortage of stress for everybody these days. And with us today to talk about stress inside of a clinic and provide some insight on that topic is Professor Diana Emanuel. Did I get your name right?
You did.
Diana
yeah.
Emanuel.
Mm-hmm.
Diana is a professor at Towson University, which is in Towson, Maryland. And she's actually written some really interesting papers recently on occupational stress and audiology. So Diana, Professor Emanuel, I thought I'd maybe have you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. It was nice to be invited. My professional background is I got a master's, PhD, and did a postdoc at Penn State. I started as a professor at Towson in 1994. So as of this August, I'll have been there for 28 years. My interest in professional issues and leadership within the profession started very early. So 2 years after I started at Towson, I was the director of audiology. 2 years after that, I created the Doctor of Audiology program. Well, I wrote the proposal. There were a lot of people that were involved in actually getting it passed, but it was the first doctorate in Towson University's 150-year history. So it was a pretty difficult accomplishment. And at the time, there were only 10 AUD programs in the US. So I was part of that group of audiologists that helped get the AUD really rolling in terms of numbers. I served as a program director for 16 years then. I'm now acting director because our director's on sabbatical, and then almost 8 years as department chair. I've been doing professional issues type research for about 21 years, and I've had a lot of leadership positions that have exposed me to various professional issues. So I was the president of our state association for a little while. I served on the CAA accreditation board for 4 years, including a year on the executive council. President of the Council of AUD Program Directors for a year. So professional issues are kind of have been part of my professional lived experience for most of my career.
Well, I guess this would fall under the umbrella of professional issues. And I know that, as I mentioned previously, you had 2 papers published. I think it was in American Journal of Audiology, talking about the lived experiences of audiologists. Mm-hmm. And you provided some insights on occupational stress within the profession. And I was hoping that you could maybe elaborate on the motivations for that line of research.
Right. So, yes, there were those 2 recent papers. We also have another paper with the principal author is Maddie Zimmer, who was worked on her project as a student, and Jess Wintz, another project. So basically, I have 4 out of my lived experience project, 4 completed projects, and there are about 8 or 9 that are currently in progress. And so I'll tell you the impetus, and it was some of it was sort of serendipity. A number of years ago, and then I started my lived experience paper with discussing that I started to feel really uneasy about the huge number of changes that have impacted the profession. And I started to sort of fear, like, where are we going? Are we, there's lots of different kinds of changes. There's changes that can cause beautiful, robust changes in a profession and changes that can destroy parts of a profession. And I've loved this profession for many years. So I was sort of uneasy and afraid. And in the back of my head, I'm like, I wonder if other people feel this way. And so that was the initial thought process. But I was a chairperson at the time, so I was doing self-study and accreditation and mission and strategic, all this stuff that gets in your way of really being able to focus on a research project. But as it would happen, my husband and I became empty nesters, and we moved to Baltimore City, and we decided to do some Airbnb. Okay. And our first guest was Dr. Ashley Duggan. And she came in with the poster, the ubiquitous poster. And, there's a researcher who's going to be presenting at a conference and putting the poster up. And so she's from Boston College, and she's a communications professor. And the paper she was presenting was came out in 2017 on the inner life of physicians. And so she and I sat down and talked about it, and I was absolutely fascinated by what she had done. And she'd taken these physicians and had them journal for a year on their experience, their lived experience, and how they deal with patient death and how they deal with being responsible for patient lives and so forth. It was absolutely delightful to read. And I thought, I wonder if I could do that with audiologists. It has to have a different flavor, though, because audiologists aren't responsible for patient death. I mean, I suppose we certainly could be, but we are not performing surgeries. We're not providing medication that could be the wrong medication and so forth. So I said, it has to have a different flavor. But I tucked it away in the back of my head, like, I'm going to do that someday. Well, a couple of months later, a colleague, a friend of mine from college reached out and said, my mother is a researcher and she wants to interview academic leaders. And you've posted a lot about being a department chair. So could you, participate? And I said, sure. So, and that was Dr. Donna Jorgensen from Delaware Valley University. And she said, I'll drive down and interview. And I said, I want you to spend a couple of extra hours here because I have a project idea that I want to discuss with you. And so I picked her brain, and she helped me create the beginning of the lived experience project, because I've had 3 decades of experience with qualitative research and survey research, with quantitative research and survey research, but I haven't done a lot of qualitative research. In fact, this was my first designed, conducted, and analyzed qualitative study. Before that, I've only done, thematic analysis from open set questions from surveys. So she really helped me. And one of the interesting parts was that she said, well, what do you want to know? What is your research question? And I said, really, at the heart of it, I want to know if other audiologists are afraid about what's happening and what's going to happen to the profession. And she said, okay, well, to approach that qualitatively, you can't ask people if they're afraid. And of course, that sort of blows the mind of someone who's a survey researcher, because you say, well, are you afraid? Yes, no. What are you afraid of? And you list all the things. And then you have an open comment box and say, please provide anything. So as I started this interview study, I had to do a significant amount of self-study and seek out mentors to get this interview right. And it started out asking, audiologists, well, what are the positive things about your work environment? With the negative things, like trying to get people to give me how they're feeling without asking them, are you afraid? Are you whatever? Those didn't work for the first couple interviews. And I chose a grounded theory approach. And one of the nice things is the research questions can evolve during the project, and so can the interview questions. And that's kind of part of the approach. And so at that point, I stopped and I said, how can I go somewhere between this vague, what are your positive and negative experiences at work, and this really specific, are you afraid? And so that's when the stress questions sort of became part of the interview. So that's when I started saying, well, tell me what brings you joy at work. Tell me what causes you frustration. What kind of stress is there at work, and how do you react to it? And so once all was said and done, I had 30 interviews. So each one was about an hour. So hundreds and hundreds of pages of transcripts. And it was too much for one article. And so the lived experience is the theoretical framework on how various things are connected. And then the second paper, which was the stress paper, was pulling the information about stressors out of it and making that into a second paper. And then there's a third paper, like I said, it's coming out in JAAA, probably in a month or so. And a student of mine had looked at burnout and stress at the same time via survey. And it's remarkable that my stress paper and hers, actually completely different people, different methodology, came up with very similar results in terms of stressors that audiologists face.
Well, it's interesting. Let's talk about the first paper, the lived experiences. If you could maybe share with us what you found, how you studied it. I mean, you kind of talked about that already, but basically what you found in that lived experiences research.
Okay. So when I started out, I took a look at what are the types of things that I could basically get at how audiologists were feeling. And so I had questions that are associated with things like, how long have you been an audiologist? How did you become an audiologist? So that gave me their origin stories. And in the interview, people just love to talk about where they came from and their origin stories and so forth. And then, what do your patients value about you? What do other healthcare professionals value about you? And how are you reacting to change? What do you see as the future and so forth? So lots of different areas in which they could possibly tell me what they were doing. And one of the interesting things is I found coming up with the themes, from this and grounded theory, you're taking the words and ideas from the participants, and through a series of systematic, coding strategies, you develop these themes. Well, that was extraordinarily time consuming, but rather straightforward. So, like the majority of audiologists mentioned hearing aid dispensers during the interview. It was not associated with any of the interview questions, but it emerged from their thought processes relative to value and change and future, whatever. And so I knew that was a theme. But the problem was I wasn't quite sure how everything connected initially, because we have such a broad perspective on hearing aid dispensers. Some people said, they're great because they increase access to hearing healthcare. Other people are like, well, they're like used car salesmen, and if I could wave a magic wand, I'd make them go away. So this is really this huge continuum of perspectives, but everybody wanted to talk about them. People were like, I'm confused with a hearing aid dispenser, so I don't feel my degree is valued, kind of thing. And so I went through this stage where I'm like, okay, I know what the themes are. They're very clear, but how are they connected? And with hearing aid dispensers, it eventually ended up becoming connected with professional identity. And so how do we as audiologists uniquely identify ourselves in hearing healthcare as separate from hearing aid dispensers? Because they're trying to increase their scope of practice, and we're trying to, portray our value and how we're unique and so forth. And so I went through, to be perfectly honest, a stage of cognitive dissonance, where I'm like, how do these connect? And it's the most difficult part of qualitative research. And the qualitative researchers I've talked about are like, yeah, because you always assume that there is, in fact, a theoretical construct you're going to be able to create. But the reality is, you interact with the data in order to create it, but I just didn't see it. And my problem was that I was completely ignoring the origin story. So origin stories are such that the majority of audiologists across the entire, I interviewed audiologists with 40 some years of experience and 2 years of experience. The origin stories are the same. The majority stumble into audiology. And this is something that's been pointed out before. Doyle and Freeman pointed out, Danae has pointed out in some of his research. And so I'm like, well, it's not original. But the thing is, I've never seen it connected to anything. And I finally went back and looked at it, and I'm like, wow, this is the linchpin. So here's how it goes. 60% of my participants have an origin story that I call the undergraduate-stumble pathway. And some research by Danae, he used the stumbler methodology, and I kind of grabbed that. And I was like, yeah, undergraduate stumbles. And so most of the students are coming into audiology because they go to the undergraduate program with an idea that they're going to do X, usually speech pathology. They generally will come into audiology via speech pathology, but not always. But then they hit something, and that is either they realize they don't like speech pathology or they don't like their current program, and they're searching around for something, and they somehow stumble into audiology. And a lot of times what's funny is there's a lot of stories where they're like, well, I was going to do pre-med, pre-dental, PT, whatever. But then I got to this one class. And this was a story where it's like, I got to this one class and knew I couldn't go there. And I did a presentation at ASHA a couple of months ago. And I said, do you know what the class is? And everybody called it out. And I'm like, yep, that's the class. And it was organic chemistry. So that story came up for me. I'm also an undergraduate stumbler. But for me, it was calculus too. I was like, I just don't really enjoy I don't want to be a math and computer science major anymore. But so they hit a stumbling block, or they decided, just don't like what I'm doing. I'm going to reach around and I'm going to stumble into this. So they shadow an audiologist or take one audiology class, or a friend of theirs says, hey, consider speech pathology. And then they go into it, they don't. So that's that stumble path. So 60%. And that's a low number. If you look at some of the other origin stories research, they find that a greater percent of audiologists enter that way. And it's the same regardless of what generation they're in. And then 40% fall into one of two camps. early purposeful, which are the people who I knew I wanted to be an audiologist from junior high, high school, whatever. And it's usually because either they or someone in their family had hearing loss, or they were exposed to American Sign Language very early on in deaf culture. And then they're the later purposeful, where they get a degree in education or engineering or something like that. And they go into the workforce and I don't like this. So they start really systematically exploring, what do I like? What is my personality like? And looking at. So those are the purposeful. And they are quite similar in how they view audiology, and very dissimilar from the stumblers. So the linchpin for the theoretical framework is that origin story has a huge impact on your perception of the profession and on the future of the profession. And I'll give you some numbers. I didn't have these in the original paper, but I just wrote them up for the for a recent editorial. So I asked the question, have you considered leaving audiology? So when you look at the undergraduate stumblers, 87% of them said, yes, I've considered leaving. When you look at the purposeful, only 36% said yes. So a third of the early purposeful said, yeah, I considered leaving, but 87%. And then I said, would you choose to be an audiologist again if you were picking a career today and you could sort of do it over? Okay. When you look at the undergraduate stumblers, 47% of them said yes, so about half. But when you look at the purposeful, 90% said yes. So 90% of them would do audiology again. And then the one question, and this was of particular interest to me as an academic, because I'm worried about recruiting future audiologists, you said, if you had friends or family looking at career choices, would you recommend audiology? Because this is really important, because we know word of mouth is very important for recruitment with audiology, because people haven't heard of it in high school. Very few students have heard of it.
Right.
So would you recommend it? Undergraduate stumblers, 39%, whereas the purposeful, 67%. So basically, when you look at these, have you considered leaving? Would you do it again? Which is kind of like, was your lived experience really meaningful and valuable? And would you recommend it to others? The early and later purposeful participants basically had a much more positive perspectives. They also were likely to indicate that they'd made changes in their clinical practice in order to deal with changes in the marketplace. They had more creative changes that they were describing. They used more positive words when they were talking about audiology. There was someone like, I never questioned what I was supposed to do. Audiology was it. I love it. I would do it again. And I would tell everyone I know to do it. And so the words they used, the phraseology, the emotion that was conveyed, and these percentages, because it was a qualitative paper, I really didn't report the percentages, but they all indicate that if you go into audiology very purposefully and you know a lot about it, and you know that it's going to basically meet your needs, your professional and career needs, that results in much more positive perspectives. And, I even was searching for other research in other areas, like, has anyone else looked at this? Does the age at which you determine something indicate how well you're going to do and how well you're going to stay? There's really not much. There's some dissertations from like 1960s about physicians, but there's really not much out there. And I've seen informal things like, you really should know what you're doing before you choose audiology, but I've never seen that connection made. Now, that doesn't describe everything, though, because there are three other pieces, and that was four, actually. One is generational differences. So people of my generation, so I'm 56 now, and I entered the field. I could have entered the field with a master's degree. I went on to get a PhD, which was fully funded. So I entered the field with no debt. And so very low costs. And I just entered a field where I could just explore what I liked, and I could really enjoy the field. Now, when you look at what's happening now, the people who are sort of a different generation, and the way that the participants described it was older and younger. Younger participants are more likely to talk about student debt problems. They're more likely to talk about, it's a different field in terms of technology, and we have the over-the-counters, and we have like this devaluing of healthcare expertise overall, not just audiology. And some of the older generation audiologists saying, well, this is we entered it in golden age. It was different then. It was all more about focus on patients and rehab and less about technology. So very different, a lot of differences in terms of generation. Mm-hmm. A lot of issues there relative to what I call value juxtaposition, meaning audiologists have tremendous self-evaluation of value, great connections with patients, really good professional experiences. They value their expertise. That doesn't always match how physicians value us, other healthcare providers, administrators, patients, and so forth. And so we really need to connect that better in order for the lived experience to be more positive. And professional identity was the last piece. Student debt was a piece, but so the audiologists were about split. I said, do you think audiologists have a strong sense of professional identity? Do we know who we are as a profession? And they were about 50-50. And the ones who really had a strong sense of professional identity, they tended to be the ones who had either moved positions for a while until they found a place where they really belonged, or they were in a niche, specialty area, cochlear implants, pediatrics, research, private practice, and so forth. And the ones who were like, no, we don't have a professional identity, and there's lots of factions, and they're always fighting with each other. And they tended to be less satisfied for whatever reason. They hadn't moved around and found a good fit. More often working in an ENT setting, sometimes private practice though, because, there's a little concern about financial viability of practice and so forth. But the ones who had picked a specialty area and who had worked hard and moved positions until they found the right place, they had a very strong sense of who audiologists are and what we do, even though we have a lot of specialty areas.
Yeah, that's really interesting about the origin story. And you said 60% of audiologists kind of stumble into the profession?
Yep. And it was dramatic in some cases. Like I was in line to get my diploma and I didn't know what I was going to do. And someone said, hey, I want to sign up for speech pathology and audiology. And I'm doing that. Like literally 5 minutes of exposure. Now that wasn't always the case, but it was pretty dramatic how many people, and my origin story is exactly the same. I'm a stumbler.
Yeah, no, I am too. That's interesting. I guess, is there any takeaway for professional organizations or for universities who are trying to recruit students? Is there any kind of takeaway message in your research? Should they try to, if somebody's stumbling into the profession, do they treat that person differently than somebody who's more internally focused or motivated? I mean, how would a university maybe use some of the research that you've conducted in this area?
So I did address that in the discussion section. I made some recommendations. And again, it's hard to say whether any of these recommendations are actually going to make a difference. You until you do it, you can't see. But so basically, my advice is, well, first of all, as a profession, we have to increase visibility, and we have to increase visibility at younger ages. It's very difficult. All professions want to be right there front and center in high schoolers' minds. You want to do this, you want to do this, but that's a challenge the profession has to face. But what I suggested for advisors, and I've been, when you teach at undergraduate and graduate levels, and you inspire, because I teach hearing science, I've taught intro to audiology, and I've been an undergraduate advisor, and someone's like, I really think I want to do audiology, and you get really excited. Because first of all, you remember how excited you were when you found audiology and fell in love with it, and you think about the potential. But we have to learn as advisors to put the brakes on and really ask, how much do you know about the field? And my suggestion even was, if they know very little, take a gap year, become a hearing aid dispenser, become a newborn hearing screener, get KOC certification and do industrial audiology, volunteer, shadow, get as much exposure as you can. And the funny thing is, and like I said, I was a director for a while, and then I was chair, and then I took a sabbatical to finish this project. But now I'm the acting director, and I'm looking through applications, and I'm starting to see it. So it's not like I, have exposed this amazing, thing that was hidden. I think audiology directors have known this for a while, and I think it plays into why our attrition rates are higher than they are for speech pathology, which I saw a lot when I was on the CAA board. That audiology programs had a lot more attrition during their programs. And some of it is mathematical. Speech pathology is 2 years and audiology is 4 years. A lot more can happen in 4 years than in 2. But I'm starting to see in these applications, students reporting that they're doing more shadowing. I have a number of audiology assistants applying for the AUD program. And people are putting in that they've been volunteering, they've been doing research. We require them to write essays and do interviews, and the essays are like, what are the trends in audiology? In other words, we're forcing them to tell us, or at least do some research into it. And then during the interview, like, why audiology? When did you choose? And I think other directors are starting to do this, but I think we do have to, unfortunately, there's this need as audiology directors. We need to fill our cohorts, and it's very difficult to do because audiology is a low visibility profession. Okay, so where speech pathology may have 400 applicants, we will have 80. Now, clearly their cohorts are larger, but still, we're competing over a too small applicant pool. And
Right.
so it's sort of the need as a director for you to get people interested and excited and applying and enrolled in audiology, that's one piece. And then saying, oh, put on the brakes, take a year or two off and make sure it seems counterintuitive where this role and this role don't meet. But I think that it's an important thing that we need to do is make absolutely sure that audiology is a good match for where people should be based on their talents and their goals and their desires. And
right.
so,
And the increased visibility has got to help also.
Oh, goodness. It would help with a lot of the issues. It would also help with the value juxtaposition. Like a lot of the poor value from others is not because we don't have high value in the marketplace. It's because they don't know what we do. Either they have no idea, or they have a little bit of an idea, or they just think we do hearing testing. But the number of people during the interviews that are like, the administrator, it's so frustrating because we're like, we need a $20,000 piece of equipment. Like, who are you and what do you do? And first of all, you have to educate them on what you do. And so it's this, like, when a physician comes and says, I need whatever, I need a sonogram machine or another x-ray. Well, everyone knows what that piece of equipment is, and they know what physicians do. What audiologists go and they say, well, I need an audiometer and it's $20,000. Oh yeah, the hearing test thing. Well, can't you get it cheaper? Or why don't you just use the other one, and can't you share? So visibility and value are just really linked, and we got to work on both of them at the same time, I think.
No doubt about it. That's good information to think about. I wanted to move it to the second topic of these articles, and that's around occupational stress. And I think that this was really interesting information too. If you could talk a little bit about your occupational stress findings and maybe relate that information, those findings, to what clinicians are going through on a daily basis in their own practice.
Right. So there hasn't been a lot of research on U.S. audiologists in terms of stress. There's been a couple on burnout, not a lot. There've been a couple on job satisfaction and so forth. There have been some done in Europe and Sweden and I think just Sweden, and then there's on New Zealand and India. So there have been other studies done across the globe. And what they found were things like they made connections with some of the demographics, like stress varies based on experience, or stress based on, work setting, or stress. And I didn't find that in my study. And in the second study, the survey study by Zimmer et al., which should be coming out soon, same kind of thing. And so I don't think that you can talk about stress being associated with one specific workplace or with people who are older versus younger. Ingrid and Gordon Blood did some work years ago with educational audiologists, and they said that, they were finding a lot more burnout with their younger audiologists and less with their older audiologists. But they suggested what happens is if someone is prone to burnout, they leave the field. And so by the time they're experienced, you've already lost the people who have a tendency to perceive stress and burnout in a certain way. But neither one of these two current studies have indicated the connection with demographics. So let me talk to you about what the stressors are.
Yes.
And it's remarkable. I won't talk too much about the Zimmer study. You'll see that in a couple of months. But basically we found similar things regardless of methodology. So the top ranked stressor were time issues. Okay. 68% of the interviews, they talked about things related to time. Don't have enough time with patients. They have too much time doing paperwork, medical records, all of those things. The second was patient issues. And so that was kind of split, which was interesting. So you'd think that all of the issues would be negativity, mistrust, and all that stuff, but we did see some of that. Zimmer saw a lot of that. But in my study, basically, it was split 50-50. About half were sort of like, patients were non-compliant with mask requirements. Patients didn't trust me. Patients thought I was ripping them off. Patients were rude. Okay, so patient-related issues are very stressful. But there was also a lot of the patient came in and they were crying because they couldn't afford a hearing aid, or the patient had such a complex problem I couldn't solve it. So some of the patient stressors are that for whatever reason, I can't help this patient the way I'd like to. And the other was the patient was a problem. And the problem stems from the patient being difficult, resistant to care. So the family is dragging them in and the person's like, I don't want a hearing aid. My family makes it. So these are patient-related issues. The third was administration. And some of that I sort of alluded to before, which is that you've got these multiple layers of administration and you're not getting the support that you need. And you have an assistant, other healthcare professionals have an assistant, and they're firing your assistant when the money's tight but not theirs. So this administration not understanding our needs, not supporting us with equipment and so forth. The next was financial, and that basically came from the private practitioners, which is, I want to give my staff as much time as possible with patients to provide the best care possible, but I also have to look at the bottom line. And especially for practices that had a lot of Medicare patients. And I know people seem to think that, if we have direct access to these Medicare patients, everything. No, the practices that see a lot of Medicare patients, they're like, our bottom line is just extraordinarily difficult to navigate because the reimbursement is so low. And so the financial issues that came in as number 4. And so lack of support was the next one, which is I don't have the equipment I need. I don't have the personnel that I need. And as we start getting down lower and lower, number 6, about 25% of them complained about colleagues. So, my colleague is not testing right. My colleague is irritating the work with. I work with a physician and they yelled at me. So colleagues, and then at the very bottom was work-life balance. That basically, though, was not all that many. So our top ones basically are time issues, patient issues, and administrative issues. And those 3 are they're the big 3, actually.
Time, patience, and administration.
Right. And yep. So that's.
So I guess I'm curious to know, I'm thinking about, let's say, there's a lot of audiologists out there that watch this channel occasionally, and they might have 20, 30 years of experiencing some of these stressors. What advice would you have for them to lessen their stress?
Okay. So when I was thinking about this, and a lot of this, by the way, I'm still investigating. And so I'll tell you what I know. I'll tell you what I think we might do. And I'll also indicate how I think we might want to consider it. So first off, there are a number of articles that are out there already that talk about how to deal with stress in audiology, and a remarkable number considering that audiology keeps popping up as it's the least stressful profession, which I think is, I'm actually working on an article right now about why that is really not encapsulating the field. But Brian Kreisman has an Audiology Today article from 2017 on stress, Casper 2009 from Audiology Today, Glenn's 2015 Hearing Journal, Nema's 2004 Hearing Journal. So there's a bunch of them out there. One of them, I can't remember, now I'm blanking on which one of these were. There's like the Zen of audiology, how to use mindfulness meditation and so forth. And so that sort of gets to, I think there's 2 ways to view it. One is, how the individual reacts to stress and what they can do about that. And the other is what we can do as a profession or as a clinic or as an audiologist to chip away at the things that are creating stress. So let me talk from the individual perspective first. So there were indicators in the interview study from a lot of audiologists where they were talking about how, stress is very individualized. It's based on personality. And they'll say something like, well, I don't stress about it, but my colleague does, or I really stress about it, but my colleague doesn't. And this was in, about a quarter of the interviews, this unsolicited popped up. And so And I also see evidence that there's a lot of individual variability in reaction to stress based on some of the numbers. So I asked people to rate stress on an average day and also on their worst day. Okay. Now they were significantly different, which means that looking at stress as a static point, like this is how stressful your job is just completely erroneous because it varies so much. And the other is that they were highly correlated. So people who had low stress on their average day also reported a relatively low stress on their worst day. And so individuals tend to react so differently to stress. So another thing that Maddie Zimmer's paper we'll see in JAAA, and basically what she said is there was a significant difference when you look at responses to the question, are you concerned about over-the-counter hearing aids? You can say yes, no, or undecided, right? And that was related to stress rating. So people who tended to be stressed about over-the-counter hearing aids had a very high overall stress rating. So some people are just stressed about everything, about their day-to-day job, about over-the-counter hearing aids. Now, my interview study, over-the-counter hearing aids was almost a non-issue. Costco and non-traditional vendors were a big issue because they didn't know how to compete financially. But over-the-counter hearing aids, they're like, it's a poor quality hearing aid. They'll be in my office eventually. Basically, they weren't as concerned about over-the-counter hearing aids. So when you look at it from an individual perspective, my next research project is going to look at personality type compared with, stress in the audiology workplace, and to really look at, is this a thing? Because if it is, it's like audiology is low stress, unless you happen to be one of these, and I'm one of them. I suffer from a lot of anxiety. And so the way I react to stress is quite different from someone who's sort of a type B, nothing bothers them type of person. And so that's the research project, but we do know from other fields, we know from research in other healthcare professions and business and so forth, that when they do these personality types, and then we take a look at responses to job-related stressors, there's definitely a correlation there. And so people, people who are reporting a lot of job stress happen to have this personality type. There's been a little bit of personality type research in audiology, but nothing compared with stressors. So I will say that we don't know enough yet. However, from my personal experience, I think if you feel like you are, compared to your colleagues, far more stressed, that would be on an individual basis where you're looking at, go and see a mental health provider. Accept therapy, accept medication if necessary. Look into these strategies like the meditation, the this, the that, and the other. Okay. So that from an individual basis is something that we're not going to be able to do as a profession by changing the profession, because no matter what profession you're in, you're going to be stressed. Right. And that's so individualized. I mean, I have tried to meditate for 40 years. It doesn't work for me. I can't turn off my brain, but exercise does. And so it is incredibly individualized. We do know that, our student affairs office is telling us as professors that we're looking at 40% of the current student population or more having significant mood disorders, which is anxiety and depression. And so, and it's underdiagnosed in people who are above college age. But the reality is, and then you add the pandemic to it, right? Mm-hmm. So audiology is 85% women approximately. And we know who the people are who suffered most from the pandemic, basically. I mean, obviously it was people who are minorities and people who are in poverty and so forth. But when you look at gender, right, women tend to be the ones who are working virtually and teaching their kids virtually and dealing. And so
taking care of the house, right?
Right. My, and it's, that if you can solve societal problems relative to gender work roles, yay. But that's the reality. 85% of audiologists women, and it accounts for, some of the stress, and it accounts also for things like salary differentials and so forth, but right, another interview. So I would definitely encourage people to do a lot of self-reflection, take some personality tests, ask for help. I'm one of those people that I don't need help. I don't need help in most of my career. Sure, I can get tenure. I can raise 2 kids. I can do this. I can do that. I can do the other, and never ask for help. But the reality is, you add the increasing workload and you add the pandemic and so forth. I think far more people need to find individual responses. But let's put that aside and let's talk about at the professional level. So we can pick away. I don't think there's a magic bullet, but I think we can pick away at things that we have to deal with as a profession that are stressful. So let's take a look at time. All healthcare professionals are really complaining about time. Reimbursement is low, these electronic medical records, all of these requirements are getting worse and worse and worse. But what was revealed in a lot of the interviews was that audiologists have, for whatever reason, accepted the fact that they do everything. So audiologists come in, they sanitize their sound booth, they get the patient from the waiting room, they photocopy their own audiograms, they do all of their own charting. They sit with a patient for a half an hour. I've also seen this on social media and figure out why the hearing aid is not connecting with the Bluetooth or showing the person how to use. Why are we doing everything? We have a doctorate. And so we should be practicing at the top of the profession and should be focusing a lot more on hierarchical business models where you have assistants, you have interns, you have whatever. And some of that is planning and some of that is advocacy. If you go into the workplace and if there's a good thing to say about the pandemic, I would say the mass resignation might work in our favor, which is if you go into the workplace and you're like, look, this is what I expect. I expect to be called Dr. So-and-so, not referred to as the girl down the hall. I expect to make this much. I expect for your office staff to do the sanitizing of the sound booths, to make sure that I have the appropriate supplies. I expect an assistant to be able to go and do the initial intake and work with the patient if they need extra time. And if they say no, then walk out the door. And it's really hard on an individual basis, but I'm hoping that more and more audiologists will do that and embrace this hierarchical model. Unfortunately, it's slow. Like you can pick away at it, but it's slow. Will that solve the time crunch? No, because we'll be redirected into seeing more patients. But, I think we need to embrace that. Another thing is, and so going back time, patients. Okay. I think we can improve some of the stress associated with patients. Again, the visibility and the value and the so forth, but with transparent pricing. And you see a lot in various conferences on how to sell hearing aids and how to, finish the sale and how to do this, whatever. And there's a lot of stress associated with that. There's a couple of interview studies that came out, Ng and colleagues, and I'm blanking on the other one. They did interviews, and basically there's this moral dilemma where audiologists feel like they're pressured into selling hearing aids when perhaps it's not the best choice. And so I think we have to really back off on, the sales perspective, use transparent pricing, and unbundle. We still have the majority of audiologists using a bundled pricing model. I know because I had a student just complete a survey on that. And if you look over time, we were at about 84% bundling in 2004. That was a Hearing Journal Audiology online survey, all the way down to, I think, I'm blanking on it, it's my own data, it's slightly over 50%. They're still bundling. We are seeing, though, a nice increase in hybrid pricing, which is, offering patients the choice of bundled or unbundled under whatever circumstance. But I think if we can do sort of more transparent pricing, and a lot fewer people just really set on saving on using bundled pricing. I had a couple things memorized, but there's so many people, David Fabre, Kim Cavett, there's a bunch of articles out there. So, there were about 3 or 4 articles and seminars and hearing on, here's how to do a financial analysis to determine exactly how you should price using unbundling to survive in the marketplace. There's so much out there. And I think if we really all as a profession focus on, here's our value, here's what it is. If you want to, purchase the device here, great. If you don't want to purchase the device here, great. When I go to for my eye care, there's an ophthalmologist who did my eyelid surgery and who does the medical stuff. There's an optometrist who deals with my vision care. And then in a completely different side of the office, all shiny and beautiful, there's the optician who sells the glasses. But the physician and the optometrist, the doctor of optometry, they don't sell. They're not involved in talking about pricing or in selling devices. They give you your prescription. If you want to go to their shiny center and buy really beautiful glasses, great. If you don't, you go somewhere else. But I don't necessarily think that we're as far along as we could be relative to that, relative to setting the hierarchical model where our value is clearly and visibly projected, prices are transparent. And if you don't want to buy from us, that's fine. Here's our hourly rate on programming a hearing aid if you purchase it somewhere else, and follow the rules that people smarter than me in business have told you.
Well, that seems like really valuable advice. Thank you. As we wrap things up here, any final thoughts or comments with respect to your research? Or you mentioned a couple other papers that are in the pipeline. If you could maybe talk a little bit about those or where we could find them. JAAA, I think you said.
Yeah. So the paper, it's Zimmer, Emanuel, and Reed, Nick Reed, who's at Hopkins. We have the paper coming out that's on. We look at, we measured resistance to change and whether that was related to use of service extender personnel or unbundling. We have a paper coming out in JAAA on burnout. That's Maddie Zimmer, me, and Nick Reed. We have another paper we're going to submit soon. That was Wentz and co-authors, and that's on looking at change, resistance to change, and whether that impacts clinical decision-making, use of service of extender personnel and bundling and unbundling and so forth. I have 3 or 4 more studies. We're looking at lived experience relative to people of color as in audiology. We're jumping back in to take a look at connections between origin stories. So there is a pipeline of projects. I've got 7 running now. I've got 7 that'll start next year. But the Zimmer looking at burnout and stress, and the Wentz looking at change resistance, those will be the ones that hopefully will come out this year.
No, well, and for those of you that maybe didn't catch the very beginning, the 2 papers we've referenced throughout this interview are both published in 2021, I think, in American Journal of Audiology. Am I correct about that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you for letting me talk about
Professor Diana Emanuel at Towson University, thank you for your contributions to the profession. And it's great having you on the broadcast this week. Thank you.
Thank you.